Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you all for being here. Tonight, I would like to take you on a journey to Australia's wildest coral reefs, because those might be perhaps the places where we can find some elusive supercoral. So normally when we think of coral reefs, I think we all picture something like this photo and several of the photos that we have seen before. Amazing underwater cities built by coral, teeming with colorful life and in crystal clear waters. And so obviously one of the key elements that corals need to thrive is actually water. And they really thrive in clear, clean waters filled with sunlight. And they like warm waters, just not too warm, because as we have heard, they're actually quite sensitive to heat stress and coral bleaching. However, in the remote Kimberley region in northwestern Australia, we actually find very unique coral reefs that exist in one of the toughest places for corals on the planet. And it seems that these coral reefs, or these corals, are actually a little bit more flexible when it comes to many of these key elements, including water. So welcome to Australia's wildest coral reefs. If you're a coral and you call this place home, then you can actually cope with sticking out of the water, like on the photo here, baking in the sun, and then only a few hours later, you're going to have 10 meters of water above you. And this is because the Kimberley region has the world's largest tropical tides, with a tidal range of up to 10 or even 12 meters. So when it is low tide, many of the shallow coral reefs get exposed to air for up to 2 or 3 hours even. And then they just sit out there and bake in the sun and experience, of course, extreme daily temperature swings. So you can go up to almost 40 degrees in the water that they sit in for brief periods of time. And I can tell you that this is the temperature that most corals cannot survive, not even briefly. And then when the tide comes back in, it actually stirs up a lot of the sediment there. And so suddenly these corals are sitting in very murky water, completely unlike the crystal clear waters that we usually associate with coral reefs. The giant tides in the Kimberley region also create other fascinating phenomena that you wouldn't even in your wildest dreams associate with coral reefs or even the ocean for that matter. For example, some of the reefs in the Kimberley have these massive river systems in the middle of the reef. And this is what the water drains off the reef when the tide rushes out. And we even have waterfall reefs and giant whirlpools that make the water look like it's cooking. So I think it's pretty clear that this is as extreme as it gets when it comes to coral reefs. But I can tell you that with very healthy shark and crocodile populations, Irukandji jellyfish, and friendly snakes everywhere, this is also a pretty tough place for researchers and research equipment. I'll leave it up to you to imagine what left the bite marks on these bottles. So when I first started studying the coral reefs in the Kimberley region, I had a feeling that we might perhaps find some supercorals there, corals that are more resistant to stress and maybe even bleaching than other corals. Because where would you find them if not in a place like that? And so I conducted a heat stress experiment, and I found indeed that the corals that come from the most extreme places in this environment, the tide pools where they get exposed to air frequently and where they experience the extreme temperature swings, these corals were more resistant to heat stress and bleaching than other corals. So this was fantastic news because we kind of found our supercorals. But then came the year 2016, the hottest year on record. And while the Great Barrier Reef, for example, was affected by the most severe bleaching in its history, mass bleaching also hit the other side of the continent, and particularly the Kimberley region. So it was quite devastating to come back to my study sites and then seeing all these bone-white corals sticking out of the water everywhere. And when I went back 6 months later, to look at how many of the corals had recovered or died, I have to admit that I wasn't too hopeful. Like seeing the extent of the bleaching back in April last year, I expected that most of the coral would have died. And indeed, in the places where I knew that the corals weren't that resistant, most of the corals had actually died, and it was quite sad. But there was also really good news. So in these tide pools, in the most extreme places, actually almost all of the corals had fully recovered 6 months later. There was almost no mortality, and the reef was essentially as healthy after the bleaching as it was before the bleaching, only 6 months later. So absolutely amazing recovery. And this is my take-home message tonight. If we just give corals enough time, then they have a remarkable capacity to develop resilience to even the most extreme environmental conditions, as for example in the Kimberley region. But the critical factors, as other speakers have pointed out today, is time. So I would urge all of you here tonight to actually take action on climate change. If we can slow down global warming, then some coral reefs, or at least the ones with the supercorals, might just have a chance to keep up. Thank you.